Hello and welcome to part 11 of this Kerbal Space Program 2 video series covering the For Science update. So in part 10, as you can see, we landed at the Duna Monument, and in this video we're going to be launching back into orbit again. We're also going to do a rendezvous and docking maneuver with what is essentially a refueling station now in space. It was the second stage of the rocket we used to get to Duna, but because we still have fuel in that stage and we used a lot more fuel during the landing than we actually intended to, we're going to need to refuel before we get back. So in preparation for that, I have made sure there is a docking port and that stage is controllable. But anyway, yeah, let's get straight into this video. So the first thing we need to do is we need to actually get ourselves into the correct transfer window with Kerbing. So we'll go onto the map, we will zoom out and focus on Kerbal, and then if you imagine this is a clock face, what we want to do is position Kerbing at around about 3 o'clock on its orbit and then put Duna at around about 12:30. So there is a very specific Delta V map that I use to know what the transfer windows are. It can be found on Reddit. I'll leave a description I'll leave a link in the description below so you can find it if you want to, or alternatively you could just Google KSP Delta V map and you'll be able to find it with relative ease. So anyway, once our ships or the two planets are in their relative or in the correct transfer window, we can now go back to our ship. So like I say, Kerbing is at 3 o'clock and Duna is at about 12:30. We could probably go a little bit further, but because of the manoeuvre we're going to do, we're going to actually leave it a little bit early for this. So anyway, first thing we need to do is we need to launch and rendezvous with the targets. So if we go onto the map, you can see that we did launch, or we entered Duna in a polar orbit. So we'll find our ship and right click on that and set target. And if we have a look at the orbit of the target ship, we can see it is at a slight inclination, so it's not perfectly polar orbit. So we are going to need to make sure that we match our launch trajectory to the, well, roughly the same inclination as the target ship. And whenever we're trying to rendezvous and dock, we always want to try and match our inclination. But as you can see, as the ship is travelling, it is travelling in this direction, so we are going to want to launch south. If we were launching from the other side of the planet, then we would want to launch north, but because the next point at which we will be going underneath the target ship's orbit is there, we're going to go for that one and then launch south. So we'll warp forwards until our ship marker is underneath the target ship's orbit. And now we are there, we can do our launch. So as I say, it's not perfectly polar, so we are probably going to need to launch a little bit to the right of the south line on the nav ball. But anyway, first thing we'll do is we will retract our solar panels so we don't lose them during the launch. And then we'll go to full throttle and retract the landing legs and ladders. And once we get to a decent height, what we're going to do is we're going to hit south on the SAS control wheel, and then once our prograde marker has gone to about 45 degrees in pitch, we'll hit prograde and then SAS off. And like I say, we do need to be going a little bit to the right of the south line, so we'll go a little bit to the right, and we do have the target marker right there, which is giving us a good idea of the general area we want to be aiming for. So anyway, during this launch we are going to be aiming for somewhere in the region of about 55 kilometers above the surface in our apoapsis, because Duna's atmosphere does end at 50 kilometers, and we want to be going well above that because we will, once we cut the throttle, our apoapsis will actually start to drop again, and we don't want it dropping back below Duna's atmosphere. So what we're going to do now is, because we are starting to gain a fair bit of speed, we're actually going to reduce the throttle a bit because we don't want to overheat the docking port and lose that. And as you can see, I've put the actual heat gauges on so we can see what's going on. We can tell that the docking port is starting to overheat. While we're here, we're actually going to hit the science button because we might be able to get a bit more science, so we'll see how that goes. It doesn't seem to be doing anything, but sometimes you can actually get more science when doing this launch. But anyway, like I said, we're going to wait until we reach around about 55,000 meters above the surface, and once there we'll cut the throttle and we will start preparing for our actual orbital burn. And if you're not planning on rendezvous and docking, then you can go higher. The reason we go into this altitude is because the target ship is around about 75 kilometers, so we're going to aim to get our orbit a little way below that. But anyway, now we have cut our throttle. You can see that the apoapsis is dropping. And what I normally do is I would normally wait until we actually leave Duna's atmosphere to create the manoeuvre, because if we were to create the manoeuvre now, then due to the fact that our trajectory is dropping, then it could mess up the actual manoeuvre itself. The only problem with doing that is it will only leave us a very small amount of time to actually create the manoeuvre. So if we go to the map and zoom in preparation for creating our orbital manoeuvre, we're then going to warp forwards until we are above 50 kilometers. And you can see now we're there, we only have just over a minute to do the manoeuvre, so I'm just going to quickly put this manoeuvre in place, and it's just going to be like any orbital manoeuvre. We're going to use the green prograde arrow to extend our projected orbit, and then use the blue radial out arrow to try and get it relatively circular. But because we've got so little time, we're probably not going to get a perfectly circular orbit on this one. And as long as our periapsis is above 50 kilometers, we should be okay. Anyway, that's probably going to do the trick. So now we are set, we need to point at the manoeuvre, which we're pretty much already there, because if you noticed I actually pointed us at prograde. And now we get into 0, we'll go full throttle and get ourselves into orbit. So we're at 54 by 57, which will do the trick. We could mess around and try and get it perfectly circular, but I'm going to leave it for this. So yeah, now we're in orbit, we will re-extend the solar panels so we don't run out of electricity. Then the next thing we need to do is, as with any rendezvous manoeuvre, we need to make sure that our inclination is matched with that of the target ship, because as you can see we're currently at 3 degrees relative inclination. So what we'll do is, because the descending node is our next node on the orbit, we're going to point at normal. And of course, if we were approaching the ascending node, we would go to anti-normal. But we'll go to normal, we will warp to a point just ahead of the descending node. And once there, we'll do a small burn just to get our relative inclination down to 0 degrees. And this is by far the most important manoeuvre you can do when trying to do a rendezvous manoeuvre, because if your inclinations aren't matched, then it can be very difficult to actually get an intercept. So now we're approaching the descending node, we'll increase the throttle and get ourselves down to 0.0. And now that's done, we can start thinking about our rendezvous. So you can see that we did come up behind the target ship, and when you are in a lower orbit, your ship is actually travelling faster than the ship in the higher orbit, so we will be steadily catching up to it. However, because our orbits are so close together, we do need the two ships to be pretty close to be able to actually get the intercept. So we'll warp forwards, and it's going to take a little while to actually get there. If you are particularly far apart, what I would recommend doing is going to the Kerbal Space Center and then into the tracking station, and then doing a warp there, because you do get the full warp capability when you're in the tracking station. Yeah, now the ships are close together, we can create a manoeuvre anywhere on our orbit. And then we will extend our projected orbit, and we can see that we are at 2,750 meters in difference, so we'll carry on extending it a little bit. And now it's starting to get further away again. We're going to move the maneuver node around until we are below 1,000 meters. You can see we can't actually get below there, so we'll keep extending a little bit to try and get our intercept. There we go. So we're going down to about 680 there, so that'll do for the intercept. So yeah, now that's set, we'll point at the maneuver and then warp to the maneuver. And we're only going to use a tiny bit of throttle for this because, as you can see, it's a 9 delta V burn, so we might even be able to do this with RCS, you know. So we'll get ourselves down to 0 seconds, and then I'm going to try RCS to start off with, and if that's going a bit too slow, then we'll use the actual throttle. But we need to make sure that we're not going too far, although it's easy enough to adjust because the ship is so light, then you know things aren't going to be too much of an issue if we do go too far, and because we're refueling, we know we can use a little bit more fuel if we need to. Anyway, now that is set, we can see that we are at 640-ish meters from the target. 618 will do. So next up, we will click on the orbit a little way ahead of the target and time warp to point. And while we're doing this, we're also going to make sure our velocity bug is set to target, and we are also going to lock to the retrograde marker. And the reason we do that is, if we were to be on the, for example, on the orbit velocity, then you can see the retrograde marker is in completely the wrong place. And what we need to do is we need to match our orbit with the orbit of the target ship. So we'll go back onto the flight view, we'll have a look around, and we should be able to find our target ship, which is right there. So once we get close, we're going to warp forwards, and once we get close, we will want to reduce our relative velocity with the target to around about, well, to 0 meters per second, or as close as we can get. And as I've said in previous videos, when we are doing a retrograde burn pointed towards the target, then we're technically doing a prograde burn because we're actually raising our apoapsis to match, or our periapsis to match with the target. So anyway, as I say, now we're here, we will increase the throttle a tiny bit, reduce our relative velocity to 0 meters per second. And then once we're there, we're not actually at perfectly 0, but 0.1 will do. Once we're there, we can point at the target on the SES control bar. And then using RCS, we're going to press H to boost towards the target. And because we're a relative distance, we're going to go to about 2.5 meters per second. You can see the camera is spinning, and the reason for that is because we're actually going over the pole at the moment. So whenever you go over the pole of a planet, the camera does spin around, which can be a little disorientating, but you get used to it eventually. Anyway, yeah, now we are heading towards the target. The other thing we need to do is make sure that the green prograde marker on the nav ball is inside of the target marker. And then we're going to do a very careful warp forwards until we get to about 150 meters from the target. And you can see during longer warps the prograde marker does drift, so we're going to need to keep adjusting that just to make sure that we are, you know, going straight towards the target. And now you can see that the target isn't actually pointed at the ship. So what we're going to do is we are going to use the square bracket key to switch to this ship. And then if the command module is close enough, we will be able to right click on it and select that as our target. However, it's not quite close enough yet. So we're going to warp a little bit further until we can highlight the ship. And you can see now we can highlight it. So we'll right click anywhere on the ship. And then we will make sure we're on the Clampetron docking port. We'll set that as the target, then we'll turn on SAS and point this ship at the target. And that just means now that the front of the ship will be pointed towards the front of the target ship. Now, I've said before, but if you are using a side-mounted docking port, then you'll need to right-click on the docking port and hit Control from here, and that will just mean that that docking port will then be what is pointed at the ship and not the actual centre of the ship. So anyway, now we are pointed at one another. We're going to square bracket back to the command module. We're going to make sure that we are lined up on the nav ball, and then once there, we're going to warp forwards until we get our docking. Now we're getting close. I'm actually going to stop the warp. I'm going to make sure everything's lined up on the nav ball, and I'm going to boost back just to reduce our speed to below 1 meter per second. Just because that way, if we hit it too hard, then we might end up breaking the docking ports. Yeah, there we are, docked with the fueling station. So now all we need to do is refuel the command module. So when you're wanting to refuel a ship, we go to this little icon on the app bar. Then we'll go into Resource Manager, and we'll find Methalox tanks, and we can put all of these Methalox tanks into the transfer section. And you can see the X216 is the one we want to be filling up, so we will click in on that, and that should automatically set all of the other tanks to out, at which point we'll then hit start, and that will transfer the fuel. So you can see there is still the tiniest amount of fuel left over in the refueling stage, but we're going to leave this up in orbit anyways, almost like the beginning of a new space station. We might even build up a space station in the future, but anyway, now that is set, we need to get back to Kerbing. So we'll quick save just to make sure that if something goes wrong, we can quick load again. Then we'll right click on the docking port and hit undock. And now what we want to do is we want to go back to the map, and you can see that because we're in a polar orbit, our inclination in relation to Duna's actual travel or orbit line is quite sharp, which can make things a little bit difficult when trying to get a encounter with Kerbing straight from Duna's sphere of influence. So what we're going to do is we'll zoom out and set Kerbing as our target. And then instead of trying to get a encounter straight from Duna, what we're actually going to do is we're first going to create a maneuver on the back of our orbit, and we are going to extend our orbit so that it is just skipping out of Duna's sphere of influence. And as with any maneuver or transfer maneuver, if we are travelling to an inner planet, which we are with Kerbing, we want to be essentially burning retrograde to Duna's direction of travel, whereas if we were coming from somewhere like Eve and trying to get back to Kerbing, we'd need to burn prograde to Eve's direction of travel. But anyway, we're going to make sure that we are, like I say, just skipping out of Duna's sphere of influence. And then once there, we will point at the maneuver and perform this burn. And the reason we're doing it like this is because when we leave Duna's sphere of influence, our orbit will be almost exactly matched with Duna's orbit, which then means that it's very easy to create a retrograde burn just after we've left Duna's SOI, bring our periapsis down towards Kerbing's orbit line, and then we should be able to get a encounter pretty easily. But anyway, as I say, now we are set. We are going to warp to the maneuver and perform this burn. So as our apoapsis extends, we're going to reduce the throttle because you can see it got very fast, and we are going a little bit faster than I would like. So I'm going to get rid of the maneuver, and I'm actually going to point at prograde and then use RCS to boost back. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that, as I say, we are just skipping out. And this is a good technique for getting back to Kerbing from any of the planets if you find that getting an encounter straight from orbit around the planet is quite difficult. So now that is set, what we'll do is we will detach the camera and move along the dotted line to the point at which we are actually leaving Duna's SOI. And if we click on the orbit, you can see that it's saying it will be 31 days until we reach that point, whereas if we went too early it says it's 1 year. So we need to make sure that we're on the lower of the two times. And then my cats are having a bit of a fight, and then what we'll do is we will create a manoeuvre there. The cats. We'll create a manoeuvre, and then we are going to perform a retrograde burn until our periapsis matches up with Kerbin's orbit line. Now you can see we have our intersect markers. So what we'll do now is we will move the manoeuvre around our orbit, and we should be able to get a encounter pretty easily. And there we go. So yeah, now we've got our encounter with Kerbin. We'll right click on that and focus on it, although that was the moon technically, but we'll make sure we're focused on Kerbin. And we could do a mid-course correction, but there's no real point in doing that at the moment. So what we'll do is we'll find our manoeuvre node, and then we're actually going to aim to bring our periapsis down to just above Kerbin's atmosphere, because you can see at the moment we're only going to be using somewhere in the region of about 800 to 900 delta V, and we have well over 1,000. So we're going to do a deceleration burn. If you find that you don't actually have that much fuel left, then you can go straight back into Kerbin's atmosphere and do a re-entry that way. And you can see we're actually struggling a little bit to get our periapsis down with just the green and purple arrows. So I'm actually going to use the radial arrows as well, and that's bringing it down nicely. So it doesn't have to be perfectly equatorial, but I like to try and get it relatively close. But yeah, I'm just going to keep playing around with our manoeuvre arrows until we actually are just above Kerbin's atmosphere. There you can see we're now at 74, 75, so that'll do. And the reason I'm doing this is because, as I say, we're only going to be spending 881 delta V, so we'll have loads of fuel left. And if I have lots of fuel left when doing a return journey, I'll always do a deceleration burn. But anyway, now that is set, we can point at the manoeuvre and perform this burn. And as with any particularly long warp, we'll need to press the warp button a couple of times to actually get to 30 seconds. Now, before we do the actual warp, we'll go back to the map. And we're going to look down on the Kerbal system, just as we did when we were going to Duna, so that we can get a good idea of how our actual trajectory is doing. So once we are at 0 seconds, we'll go full throttle and perform our return burn. And it looks like we're actually going straight into Kerbin's surface there now. So we'll zoom back in on Kerbin, and yeah, we don't necessarily want to do that, although we could, but there is a risk if you hit the atmosphere too hard, then you might end up burning up. So we're going to use RCS just to burn backwards a little bit until we get to just above the atmosphere. So 79 will do. So yeah, now we need to transfer back to Kerbin. So we'll come over towards our orbit, and then we will click on the orbit, and you can see that if we were to click on that line there, then we would probably be doing another full orbit of Kerbin. So we're going to click on the one we think is the correct one. And you can see that's saying 253 days, whereas the other one would be over a year. So yeah, we need to go for this one. We will try and get just inside of Kerbin's SOI. That looks like it would be the wrong one, so I'm going to click just before, because we know this is definitely the correct line we want to be at, and time warp to point. And it doesn't matter that we went out of communication range there, because we do have well, we've got Kerbals on board this ship, and now we know exactly which one we want to be clicking on, which, as I say, is now 3 days ahead, so we will time warp to point so that we're actually inside Kerbin's SOI. And now we're here, we can create our deceleration burn. So, as with any transfer from any planet, when I'm doing a deceleration burn, I'll create the manoeuvre a little way ahead of our periapsis. Then, because we've got so much fuel, well, basically whenever I'm doing this, I would just burn all of the fuel that's in the tank. So we'll do that until it says no fuel. Then we will move the manoeuvre node around and click on our periapsis, and I'm just going to go back to the flight view and then back to the map to get rid of all that extraneous information. As I say, we will move our orbit around until our periapsis is below 30 kilometers. I usually aim for about 25. So now that's set, we can point at the manoeuvre and do our deceleration burn. So as I say, we're going to burn this tank until it's empty, and there is actually a chance while we're doing this burn we could end up dropping below Kerbin's atmosphere, so we'll make sure we're set to ground just to be sure, although it doesn't really make that much of a difference. And then once we have emptied this tank, we're going to point straight at normal. Either normal or anti-normal will do. We'll point straight at normal, decouple the tank and engines, and then go straight to anti-normal, so our heat shield is pointed into Kerbin's atmosphere, and we know we're not going to end up burning up. So now that's done, we'll ditch the tank and engines. Like I say, we'll then point retrograde, and now we can warp into the atmosphere. So we have already done our atmospheric survey over the water, so we don't need to do any more science. It does flash for some reason, even when we've done all the science in the area, but yeah, I know we've already done the science, so we're not going to bother hitting that. Now, when we come over land, we will go over a new biome, and you can get science from all of the different biomes with the atmospheric survey, but you can see that the biomes are changing pretty quickly. We need about 2 minutes to do the science, so when coming in from orbit like that, then it's almost impossible to actually get more science unless you are over the water. But anyway, now we have re-entered, we're going to stop the warp, and we are going to deploy the drogue chutes. We're also going to turn off SAS. And as with any of my ships, I've set it up so that when I press 1 on the keyboard, we will cut the drogues and then deploy the mains. But yeah, that's pretty much all there is for this video. Like I say, the reason I did this video is because when we are in a polar orbit, then it can be quite difficult actually getting back to Kerbin straight from orbit, so it's a good technique to get down. If you're struggling to get an encounter from any planet, then I would always recommend just skipping out of its sphere of influence and then doing the retrograde burn, and that should get you back relatively easily, as long as you're in the correct transfer window. But yeah, like I say, that's everything for this particular video. The next video, we are actually going to be going to Joule for the first time, and this is where it starts to get interesting for me, because in all of the years that I've been playing Kerbal Space Program, KSP1 and 2, I've actually never been further than Duna, and I only went Duna for the first time when I was doing the Duna tutorials, so yeah, it's going to be an interesting one from now on. But anyway, like I say, that's everything for this video and for our Duna mission. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I would really appreciate if you would like and subscribe, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.